She called the cops on him. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just kept looking at the car. The officer arrived, spoke to him quietly, glanced at something in his hand, and left without another word. The dealer stood in her doorway, navy blazer, arms crossed, certain she had won. She hadn't asked his name. She hadn't asked what he saw under that tarp. That was the most expensive mistake she would ever make. His name was Daniel Rowe. He woke every morning at 5:15 without an alarm. Not because he was disciplined, though he was, but because the house was loudest in those first minutes before the light came. The pipes settled. A bird he had never identified worked through the same 4 notes outside the kitchen window. The coffee maker, set the night before, breathed and hissed on the counter. He had lived alone for 3 years, and the house had developed a rhythm around him, the way water shapes itself to whatever holds it. He made his coffee black. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking at the backyard. There was a garden there that he kept immaculately. Not because he loved gardening, but because Elena had, and because letting it go felt like a second loss he wasn't prepared to absorb. He trimmed it on Sundays. He watered it on Wednesdays and Saturdays. He had kept every plant she planted, even the difficult ones, even the ones that required more attention than made any practical sense for a man living alone. On the kitchen windowsill sat a small brass key. It was old, not antique, just old, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. It opened nothing anymore. The lock it belonged to had been replaced long ago, in a building across town that Daniel had owned for 11 years. Elena had held that key on the day they signed the papers. She had turned it over in her palm and looked at him and said, "We actually did it, didn't we?" He had kept it in his jacket pocket for a decade. After she died, he moved it to the windowsill, close enough to see, far enough not to reach for every hour. Most people who knew Daniel Rowe knew him as the quiet man who had sold his legal practice 3 years ago and more or less disappeared from the professional circles he had moved through for 20 years. He had been, in that former life, one of the most respected commercial property attorneys in the state. Not famous, not loud about it, but known by the people who mattered in that world. He had structured deals that shaped city blocks. He had read the contract that other lawyers brought to him when they couldn't find the flaw they knew was there. He had a mind for property the way some people have an ear for music. It wasn't effort. It was just the way he heard things. He had left it all the same, not dramatically. He had wound things down over 6 months after Elena's diagnosis, handed his cases to colleagues he trusted, and simply stopped. She had told him not to. He had done it anyway. He was not going to spend whatever time they had left in a conference room. What he did not leave was the property. He owned 6 commercial buildings across the city, bought over 15 years, quietly, methodically, the way he did most things. He had a management company that handled the day-to-day. He reviewed the reports on the 1st of every month, made decisions when decisions were needed, and otherwise lived the life of a man with no particular claim to anyone's attention. He drove an old truck. He wore his same 3 jackets in rotation. He had no social media, no press, no profile. He was, to almost everyone who encountered him at a hardware store, or a diner, or the edge of a car dealership lot, simply a middle-aged man in worn boots who seemed to have nowhere especially important to be. He had found the car through a contact, an old mechanic named Ferris, who called him sometimes when something interesting surfaced. Ferris didn't deal in interesting things often, but when he did, he was worth picking up for. The message had come on a Tuesday. "There's something at Harlow Prestige on the east side, under a tarp in the back corner. They don't know what they have. You might." That was enough for Daniel. He knew Harlow Prestige by reputation. It was the kind of dealership that sold the idea of a car as much as the car itself. Marble floors, backlit signage, salespeople in fitted suits who spoke about provenance and craftsmanship, and the emotional experience of ownership. He had driven past it 100 times. He had never had a reason to stop. He pulled in on a Wednesday morning. He parked the truck at the edge of the lot, which was already a small declaration, and walked past the new inventory without a glance. He found the tarp in the far corner of the secondary lot, beside a row of vehicles flagged for trade-in processing. The car beneath it was low and long. The tarp was dirty and improperly secured at one corner, which was how he got his first look without touching anything he wasn't supposed to. He crouched, he looked, and in the first 30 seconds, before anyone had noticed him, before anyone had come to ask what he was doing, he saw something that made him go very still. Along the lower edge of the driver's side rocker panel, where the body met the chassis, there was a seam. It was subtle. It was exactly where it should not have been on the car this vehicle appeared to be. And it was exactly where it would be on the car he suspected it actually was. He had read about that seam in a restoration document 12 years ago. He had never expected to see it in person. He stayed crouching. He did not take out his phone. He did not call Ferris back. He simply remained there, very still, in the manner of a man who has just understood something and is taking a moment to let it settle completely before deciding what to do next. That was when the saleswoman appeared. Her name was Victoria Harlow. She was 34, third-generation dealership, and she wore her authority the way she wore her blazer, precisely fitted, never creased, designed to communicate that the person inside it did not have time for whatever this was. She had been watching him from the showroom window for 4 minutes before she came out herself. She had sent a salesman first. The salesman had come back with an expression she didn't like, and so she had come out herself, because some things required the principal. She crossed the lot with the particular stride of someone who has made many people feel small in many parking lots and found it efficient. He was still crouching when she reached him. She stopped 2 feet away and looked down at him, at the worn jacket, the muddy boots, the truck parked at the wrong angle by the entrance, and made every calculation she was going to make in the space of about 2 seconds. "Sir." Her voice was pleasant in the way that scalpels are precise. "This vehicle isn't part of our available inventory. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." He looked up at her. He didn't stand immediately. He took one more look at the rocker panel, unhurried, and then he stood. "I'd like to make an offer on it," he said. She smiled. It didn't reach anything above her cheekbones. "It's not for sale. It's flagged for disposal. We're having it collected next week. I understand that. I'd still like to make an offer." She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they've decided a conversation is already over. "Sir, I don't think you understand what we do here. This is a prestige dealership. The vehicles we process, even for disposal, go through our corporate acquisition channels. It's not a matter of," she paused, letting her eyes travel briefly to his truck, then back, "walk-in offers." He nodded once, said nothing. She took that as resolution and turned to go. 40,000, he said. She stopped, turned back slowly. "Cash," he said, "for the vehicle as it sits. No inspection contingency. I'll arrange transport myself." Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite amusement. It was the look of a person recalibrating their approach, not because they've changed their mind, but because the situation has become slightly more interesting than expected, and interesting things can still be resolved, just differently. "That's a generous offer for a car we're disposing of," she said. "But our process doesn't allow for private cash transactions of that kind. It creates complications." She said complications the way people say no when they want to sound like they're saying something more sophisticated. "Who does allow for it?" he asked. "I'm sorry? Who in your organization has the authority to approve a private sale outside your standard acquisition channel?" The question landed differently than she expected. It was too precise. It was the kind of question a person asks when they already know the answer and are establishing whether you do too. She studied him for a moment, really looked, for the first time, and found nothing that revised her initial assessment. Old jacket, quiet hands. Nothing that suggested she was in any kind of territory she hadn't navigated 100 times before. "That would be above my level," she said. "And frankly, I don't think this is a conversation we need to continue. She straightened slightly. I'm going to ask you one more time to leave the lot. If you don't, I'll need to call someone. He looked at her steadily. I'd prefer to wait for the manager. She called the police. She did it from inside the showroom, at the reception desk, in plain view of two salespeople and a customer who had just come in to look at a sedan. She did not lower her voice. She described him with a composure that was itself a kind of performance. Suspicious individual, refusing to leave, making unsolicited offers on vehicles. And when she hung up, she walked back to her office and sat down and answered 3 emails while she waited, because she was that certain this was already finished. The officer arrived in 11 minutes. Daniel was still beside the car. He had not moved to the showroom. He had not sat down. He stood at the edge of the tarp with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the patrol car come through the entrance, with the particular stillness of a man who has calculated his position and found it solid. The officer was young, mid-20s, careful in the way new officers are careful when they're not yet sure what kind of situation they're walking into. He approached Daniel with his hat on and his posture neutral. Afternoon, he said. Got a call that you're on the property after being asked to leave. I haven't been asked to leave by anyone with authority to ask me, Daniel said. I asked to speak to the manager. They called you instead. The officer glanced at the dealership, then back. Can I ask what your business is here? Daniel reached into his jacket. Not fast, not slow. He produced a card and held it out. The officer took it. He read it. His eyes moved across it once, then tracked back to the beginning and moved across it again. It was a property management card. Clean, simple, no embellishment. It listed Daniel's name, a phone number, and below that, in small, clean type, an address. The address was 4400 East Commerce Boulevard, the building they were currently standing in front of. The building the Harlow Prestige dealership had been leasing for 11 years. The officer looked up. Daniel said nothing. The officer handed the card back, touched the brim of his hat, and walked to the patrol car without another word. Victoria Harlow watched from her office window as the cruiser pulled out of the lot. She could not see what had been on the card. She could not hear what had been said. What she could see was that the officer had left, and the man in the worn jacket was still standing beside the car, and he was looking at it again, and he looked entirely unbothered. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to her emails. She had a process for things like this, and the process would handle it. It always did. She was wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. He called Ferris that evening. Ferris, 71, retired, and had spent 40 years working for 3 of the most significant classic car restoration houses in the country, before his knees gave out, and he moved to a small house 40 minutes outside the city. He knew things about cars the way Daniel knew things about property. Not from books, though he had read all of them, but from decades of contact. From the specific resistance of a bolt that hadn't been touched in 60 years. From the sound a door makes when it closes on a frame that was hand-fitted rather than stamped. Daniel described what he had seen. The seam on the rocker panel, the profile of the body under the tarp, the specific rake of the rear, the width at the shoulders, the height from ground to sill. He described it the way he had trained himself to describe things in his legal years, precisely, without editorializing, in the exact order he had observed it. Ferris was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where did you say this was?" "Harlow Prestige, East Side." Another silence. "Don't touch it again until I get there." He arrived the next morning at 7:45 in a car that was older than most of the people who worked at the dealership. Daniel met him in the lot. He had called ahead, not to Victoria Harlow, but to the regional property management office that handled his buildings, and asked them to send a formal letter of introduction to the dealership's corporate parent confirming his ownership of the premises. He had not made a scene of it. He had simply ensured the ground was level before anyone started walking on it. Victoria Harlow was already in the building when they arrived. She came out when she saw them, the same stride, the same blazer, a different day. She looked at Ferris the way she had looked at Daniel, made the same rapid calculations, arrived at the same general conclusions. Two men in old clothes. One of them she'd already had removed once. "Mr. Rowe," she said. The name came out clipped. Someone had briefed her. "I've received correspondence from your management company. I've passed it to our legal team." "That's fine," Daniel said. "This is Ferris. He's a consultant I've brought to look at the vehicle." She opened her mouth. "As the building's owner," Daniel said quietly, "I'm asking for access to the secondary lot for 30 minutes. That's all." She closed her mouth. The legal letter was still warm. She was smart enough to know that the next thing she said mattered, and smart enough not to say the wrong one. She stepped aside. They walked to the car without ceremony. Ferris didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. He moved around the vehicle slowly, the way old men move when they're not conserving energy, but conserving attention, making sure each observation is complete before beginning the next. He crouched where Daniel had crouched. He ran his fingers along the same seam. He pressed gently at a point just behind the front wheel arch, checking the give of the metal, the depth of the corrosion. He lay flat on the ground, 71 years old, on the asphalt of a Prestige dealership lot, and looked at the underside of the chassis for a full 3 minutes. He stood slowly, with the dignity of a man who has never once been embarrassed by what his work required of him. He looked at Daniel. He said, "It's a 427, not a question, not a hypothesis. A verdict delivered by a man who had spent 4 decades earning the right to deliver it without hedging." Daniel said nothing. He had known since the rocker panel, but knowing and hearing it confirmed by Ferris were 2 different weights, and he let the second one settle completely. What sat under that tarp, beneath the grime and the oxidized paint and the years of indifferent storage, was a 1966 Shelby Cobra 427, not a replica, not a tribute build. The real object, with its hand-formed aluminum body, and its side-oiler Ford engine, and its chassis number that, if verified against the Carroll Shelby registry, would place it among fewer than 30 surviving, authentic examples in the world. The dealership had taken it in as part of a deceased estate, a bulk acquisition. 6 vehicles, none of them individually assessed. It had been logged as an unidentified vintage sports car, condition poor, and flagged for auction disposal at the lowest tier. No one had looked closely. No one had crouched down. No one had known what question to ask. Ferris took out his phone. He photographed the chassis number through the gap at the base of the firewall. A sequence of stamped digits, partially obscured by rust, that he read with the patience of a man reading scripture in a damaged manuscript. He sent the photographs to a contact at a registry in California without a word of explanation. The response came back in 22 minutes while they were standing there. He showed Daniel the screen. The number matched. Across the lot, through the glass of the showroom, 2 salespeople had drifted toward the window. They were trying not to make it obvious. The junior one had his phone out. The senior one had his arms crossed, watching Ferris with an expression that had moved, slowly, visibly, from indifference to something more alert. Victoria Harlow appeared beside them. She looked out at the 2 men by the tarp. She looked at Ferris, flat on the ground, then standing, then on his phone, and something in her posture shifted, not dramatically. A small recalibration, the kind that happens when a situation you were certain about begins to develop features you didn't plan for. She came out of the showroom. She walked to the edge of the secondary lot and stopped. She didn't cross into it. She stood at the boundary, and for the first time since Daniel had arrived at her dealership, she didn't say anything immediately. She waited. Ferris looked at her. He was not a man who softened things for comfort. "You were going to dispose of this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the fact, laid flat. She looked at the car, then at him. "We had it assessed on intake," she said. "It was logged as unidentifiable, condition poor." "Who assessed it?" She didn't answer that. Ferris nodded slowly, as if she had. He looked at Daniel. "You'll want an independent authentication. Full chassis verification, engine stamp, body panel provenance. That's 6 to 8 weeks if you use the right people." He paused. "But it's real. I've seen 3 of these in my life. I know what I'm looking at." Daniel folded the registry confirmation and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the car one more time. The dirty tarp, the asphalt, the fluorescent edge of the dealership sign reflected in a puddle nearby. And then he looked at Victoria Harlow. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She was already doing the arithmetic. He could see it happening behind her eyes. The number climbing, the error assembling itself in full, the exact shape of what her certainty had cost her becoming clear for the first time. He buttoned his jacket. "We'll be in touch," he said. She came to his house. He hadn't expected that. He had expected a call from her legal team, or a letter, or some corporate maneuver, dressed up in professional language, designed to complicate the transaction without appearing to. That was how these things usually moved. That was the grammar of institutions protecting themselves. Instead, she came to his house on a Friday evening alone, in her own car, not the dealership's, a detail he noticed, and rang the bell at 6:15 while he was making dinner. She was still in the navy blazer. He wasn't sure she owned anything else. He opened the door and looked at her without surprise. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "I'd like 5 minutes." He considered that. Then he stepped back and let her in. She stood in his kitchen, not sitting, not offered a seat, though he didn't withhold one deliberately. It simply didn't occur to either of them that this was that kind of conversation, and looked briefly at the room the way people do when they're trying to recalibrate someone against their surroundings. The kitchen was clean and spare. There were books stacked on one end of the table. On the windowsill, the brass key caught the last of the evening light. She looked at it for a half-second longer than everything else. Then she looked at him. "I want to make this right," she said. He waited. "The vehicle, I understand what it is now. I've had our own people look at it since your consultant's visit." She paused. "I'd like to offer you a settlement. Fair market compensation agreed privately, in exchange for—" "No," he said. She had prepared for resistance. She reached into the folder she was carrying. "I have a figure here that I think reflects Victoria." He said her name the way he said most things, without weight, without edge, just precisely. "I'm not interested in a private settlement." She stopped. She looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the composure slipped enough to show what was underneath it, which was not arrogance but something more familiar. Fear. The specific fear of a person who has built something over a long time and can feel it tilting. "The dealership has been in my family for 30 years, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her steadily. "I know that. Whatever you think of how this was handled." "I don't think anything about how it was handled," he said. "I think you made a decision based on what you saw. People do that." She was quiet. That was not what she had come prepared for. Anger she could have worked with. Grievance she knew how to navigate. This was harder. A man who declined to perform the wound she had given him, which made it impossible to offer him a bandage in exchange for silence. "Then what do you want?" she asked. He turned back to the stove. He adjusted the heat under the pan, unhurried, and picked up a wooden spoon. "Contigation takes 6 to 8 weeks, he said. "After that, the car goes to auction. That process is already in motion." He paused. "What happens after the auction is public record. There's nothing private to settle." She stood there another moment. He didn't turn around. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove, and, outside, the bird he had never identified working through its 4 notes in the early dark. She picked up her folder. She walked to the front door. She opened it herself. She stopped in the doorway. He could hear it, the pause of a person deciding whether to say the last thing or leave it. "I didn't know who you were," she said. He kept his eyes on the stove. "I know you didn't." She left. He listened to her car start, back out, and disappear down the street. Then he stood in the silence of the kitchen for a moment, just standing, not moving, the wooden spoon in his hand. and looked at the brass key on the windowsill. Elena had held that key the day they bought the building. She had turned it over in her palm and said, "We actually did it, didn't we?" He had said we did. And she had laughed, not at anything in particular, just the kind of laugh that escapes when something you worked toward for a long time finally becomes real, and your body doesn't know what else to do with the feeling. He set the spoon down. He looked at the key a moment longer. Then he turned back to the stove and finished making dinner and ate alone at the table with a book open beside his plate in the quiet house that had learned his rhythm. And outside the window the garden held its shape in the dark, exactly as she had left it. The authentication took 7 weeks. It came back clean. Every stamp, every seam, every panel, verified against the Shelby registry, cross-referenced with the original build documentation that Ferris had tracked down through a collector in Arizona who had been sitting on it for 20 years without knowing its full significance. The chassis number matched. The engine stamp matched. The body provenance matched. The car was exactly what Ferris had said it was, standing on the asphalt of a Prestige dealership lot at 7:45 in the morning in his good shoes. A 1966 Shelby Cobra 427, one of 29 surviving authenticated examples in the world. Condition poor on the surface, structurally exceptional beneath it. The kind of object that had survived decades of obscurity, not through luck but through the particular mercy of having been stored rather than driven, hidden rather than shown, owned by people who didn't know what they had, and therefore never did anything to damage it. It went to auction on a Thursday in November at a house in the city that handled significant collector vehicles. The room was not large. These rooms never are, because the people who attend them prefer it that way, but it was full. Word had moved through the collector community in the weeks following authentication, the way significant things always move in small worlds, quietly, specifically, with the particular velocity of information that serious people have been waiting for without knowing it. Daniel arrived early. He wore the same jacket. He sat in the third row and did not speak to anyone before the proceedings began, though several people made their way to him. A nod, a handshake, a brief exchange, in the manner of a world acknowledging one of its own after a long absence. Ferris sat beside him. He had driven in that morning. He had not been asked. He had simply called the night before and said he was coming in the tone of a man for whom that settled the matter. The car came up 40 minutes into the session. It had been cleaned, not restored, not touched beyond what was necessary to present it honestly, and it sat on the auction floor under careful lighting that made no attempt to flatter. It looked like what it was. Old, worn, undeniably completely real. The auctioneer opened at $2 million. The room moved immediately. Not frantically. This was not that kind of room, but with the purposeful energy of people who had come prepared and were now executing. The number climbed in increments that would have been shocking in any other context, and were simply the correct grammar here. 3 million, 4, 5, 6. A pause at 7-2 that lasted long enough for the room to breathe, and then a phone bidder from Europe entered and the number moved again. 9 million. Ferris looked at the ceiling. 11.5. Daniel looked at his hands. He was not a man who performed emotion in public, but his hands were very still in the way that hands are still when the person they belong to is working to keep them that way. 14 million. The phone bidder, and a man in the front row who had not moved his paddle once without complete certainty. Back and forth. The room had stopped being a room and become something else. A held breath, a collective suspension. Everyone present simply witnessed two people deciding the value of an object that a dealership had been about to send to disposal for $1,100. The man in the front row set his paddle down at 16.2. The phone bidder went to 17 million. Then, after a silence, to 17.8. The gavel came down. $17,800,000. The room exhaled. Someone near the back began to clap, and then the room did too. Not the theatrical applause of spectacle, but the genuine kind. The sound of people who understand what they have just witnessed and want to mark it honestly. Daniel did not clap. He sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at Ferris. Ferris was looking straight ahead at the car on the floor, still sitting there under its careful lighting, unchanged, unbothered by what it had just become in the eyes of the room. And his expression was the expression of a man who has loved something his whole life and has just watched the rest of the world catch up. She was going to disposal it for $1,100, Ferris said quietly. Daniel said nothing. $1,100. I know, Daniel said. Across the room, near the entrance, a woman in a navy blazer stood very still. She had come. He hadn't known she would, but she had come. And she was standing at the back, with her arms at her sides, and her face carrying the specific stillness of a person absorbing something they cannot revise or appeal or settle privately. The number was in the room. It was in every phone, every notebook, every record. It was, as Daniel had told her on a Friday evening in his kitchen in public. She looked at him across the room. He looked back. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and shook Ferris's hand. He was home before dark. That was the thing he noticed first. That there was still light in the sky when he turned into his street, still enough warmth in it to make the garden visible from the driveway. He sat in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine, not thinking about the number, not thinking about the room or the gavel or Victoria Harlow's face at the back of it, just sitting in the particular quiet of a man who has arrived somewhere and is taking a moment to confirm that he is actually there. He went inside. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove and stood at the kitchen window while it heated, looking at the garden in the last of the light. The difficult plants Elena had chosen were still there, the ones that required more attention than made practical sense, the ones he had kept not because he was a gardener, but because he was a husband, still in the ways that mattered to him. The kettle came to a boil. He made his tea and carried it to the table and sat down. The book was still there from the night before, open at the same page. He didn't read it. He just sat with the tea and the quiet and the particular quality of an evening that feels different from other evenings without being able to say exactly why. After a while, he reached into his jacket pocket. He had got up and reached into it without deciding to, and took out the brass key. He set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it the way he had looked at the car under the tarp, carefully, completely, without needing it to be anything other than what it was. She had held it the day they signed the papers. She had turned it over in her palm and looked at him with that look she had, the one that wasn't surprise exactly, more like recognition, like something she had believed in for a long time had finally shown up in a form she could hold, and said, "We actually did it, didn't we?" He had said we did. He picked up the key. He held it a moment. Then he set it back on the windowsill, in its place, where the morning light would find it. He finished his tea. He washed the cup. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the near dark, the garden just visible through the window, the house settling into its evening sounds around him, the pipes, the bird, the particular silence of a life that is not loud but is, in every way that has ever mattered, full. He went to bed before 9. He slept without difficulty. He woke at 5:15, without an alarm, to the sound of the house at its quietest and the bird outside the window, working through its 4 notes in the early gray light. He made his coffee. He stood at the window. The garden was still there. Some men spend their whole lives making noise so the world will look at them. Daniel Rowe had simply done the work, and waited, and known what he was looking at when it mattered. That was always going to be enough.